And anyone, there you go. It's going to be recorded. Anyone who registered will receive this link in the next couple of days. And we ask that you use the Q&A feature for any questions you may have, and we will try to get to them at the end. And if you're liking what you hear and you want to share it on social media, tweet along with the conversation, we'd encourage you to use the hashtag PPRA program to keep this community conversation going online. So now I will turn it over to Samantha Biles, PPRA's DEI chair and the moderator of today's discussion, to introduce our speakers and get this program started.
Thanks, London. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this program, Allyship Behind the Headlines. This is the first program that we're doing under this series of events where we're hoping to engage different identity groups within the media and communications industry here in Philadelphia and learn a little bit more about their experiences and hear their voices on being media and communications professionals here, what challenges they face and what challenges their community has faced in being portrayed in the media, but also learn about ways that we as PR practitioners and communication professionals on our own can help be allies as they're, facing these challenges and problems, can be supporters of their groups and communities, and just be active allies in this discussion. DEI has become a pillar for PPRA, and this series of events is one way that we're hoping to continue that engagement with both our members and the Philadelphia community as a whole. So with that being said, I am excited to have our first two guests for Allyship Behind the Headlines. I'll allow them to introduce themselves, and Diana, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Samantha. Hi, everyone. My name is Diana Liu, and I am the coordinator for the Germantown Info Hub, which is a community-centered journalism project based in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. And we are a combination of community organizing, academia and research, and good old-fashioned journalism. And I am also a contributing editor for Root Quarterly magazine.
Aishika, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Samantha. Also, thank you for organizing this event. Hi, everyone. My name is Aishika Jennela. I work at the Asian American Chamber of Commerce of Greater Philadelphia as the Director of Communications and Member Relations. So I handle the organization's social media as well as external communications with stakeholders and manage our membership program. I also identify as South Asian, specifically Indian American. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aishika. And I'm so glad that you mentioned how you identify, because I think, AAPI is such a broad term. It includes so much. And, while I'm so happy to have both of you here, I encourage everyone to kind of take a deep dive into all things AAPI and explore and learn the many layers that consist of being the AAPI community. So Diana, I don't know if you want to share as well how you identify.
Yes, thanks for the reminder. So I'm ethnically Chinese, but my family's from South Vietnam, and I was born in the Philippines, and I was raised in California. So I'm culturally Chinese Vietnamese, as well as Californian.
Yeah. Nice. And again, there's so many different layers to AAPI. So thank you for just sharing that and sharing that information with us. So just to kind of jump in, over the past year, I know has been challenging for people of color and minorities overall. But I think the reason why this event is important is because we want to make space for the AAPI community. So just kind of to start off the conversation, what challenges or problems have you seen the AAPI community face over the last year, especially as it relates to their portrayal in the media or how the news is highlighting their community? But what challenges have you seen and have stood out to you over the past year? And to go one step further, do you see these challenges or problems as reoccurring, or is this new for the community overall? Aishika, I'll start with you.
So specifically focusing on the business side of things, what we at the chamber saw a lot was basically a rise in anti-Asian bias and violence throughout the country as well. And that really affected our businesses, specifically in Chinatown, where people were avoiding eating out at Chinese restaurants or any other Asian-owned establishment in Chinatown specifically. And then we've also done a lot of research has been done on this, and Asian American owned businesses nationwide have been the most negatively impacted by the pandemic because of anti-Asian violence as well as just lack of people going out and shopping out of all demographic groups. And then within that as well, there has been a total lack of funds given to Asian owned businesses specifically, such as with the PPP loans and everything. And that broadly includes a lot of BIPOC owned businesses as well, where a lot of communities, a lot of these more marginalized communities just didn't receive funding compared to white owned businesses. So that was something that was very challenging. And I think with Asian owned businesses specifically, it was due to a result of lack of language accessibility, as well as direct outreach to Asian owned businesses, since a lot of them are owned by older immigrant communities that might not have like the language, the English ability to understand the forms and everything. And what else we have seen is the lack of disaggregated data around specifically anti-Asian violence. I feel like a lot of people think anti-Asian American communities in general are just a monolith that have all the same issues, but when you really break it down, we all have very individualized issues, depending on East Asians versus Southeast Asians or South Asians, as well as like Western Asians and stuff. And there has been a total lack of like communication around all these different issues the communities face. So that's something we've been trying to deal with at the chamber as well. Like, how do we address all these individual communities and really support them?
Yeah, and again, that's a really good point, highlighting the different layers of the AAPI community and realizing that, it's not a one size fit all solution, that you'll need to dig a little bit deeper and figure out what works for each audience. And having the media not highlight that, I can see that being a challenge for the work that you do.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Diana? Yeah. Diana, how about you?
Yeah, first of all, I definitely want to add on to the disaggregated data point for sure. I think that the way that the AAPI community has been portrayed for a long time has kind of played out in terms of the model minority myth and how when Asian Americans are seen as a monolith and the little bit of data that is available, it skews in a way that, so people tend to circulate this. So a lot of times I think when there are surveys going on, it will just highlight Black, Latinx, and white. And so Asians are often not even included in data sets, but when they are, it looks at household income. But part of the problem with that type of surveying and data collection is that it is geared towards those who already buy into that model. So they are English speaking, typically higher educated, or even just have educational attainment beyond high school degree. And you only need there's a Pew report that kind of goes into this a little bit, but sort of like that type of self-reporting ends up fulfilling kind of some of those stereotypes. And so I think that has been a fog that's been over how the AAPI community has been covered for a long time. So I kind of wanted to set the scene with that. And because then it is really dangerous in how it paints a monolithic community that is not in need, because it suggests that we are all higher income and deeply college educated. And but to the point of what the past year and a half has looked like, some of the challenges for journalists and media makers, there has been a little bit of fear in covering what's going on, especially in terms of the violence, because many Asian American journalists have experienced racial slurs being thrown at them, And there has been concern about violence against journalists while they're covering this. And also then in terms of the Atlanta shooting in particular, a lot of AAPI journalists being told by their by leadership in newsrooms that perhaps they're too emotional to cover this, or maybe they're too close to the issue. And so then what happened with that is that there is a coverage that does not focus on the communities with lived experiences or the victims, but instead is focused more on a white narrative. And in the case of Atlanta, the perpetrators' viewpoint and a little bit of the police. So I think that continues to be a challenge. And then also piggybacking off of what Aishika was saying about language access and cultural barriers. So for the media makers, there's one challenge, and then for Asian American news consumers, there's an issue of language barriers and a lack of relation that's available for non-native English speakers. And again, looking at all the different individual communities. So then we end up having some platforms where majority English speaking folks are doing the fact checking, and they again reach out to kind of like a smaller fraction of the community. And so these issues are not being covered as much, and they're also not being consumed because of the language and cultural and digital access barriers.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really good point too, because you're not seeing a lot of just with translation alone. It's for the AAPI community, it could be Mandarin, it can be Hindu, it can be, but there's probably hundreds of languages that it can be into. And I think translation alone, Philadelphia Inquirer, its main page is all in English. So for those who are non-English speaking, how do you make sure that they're getting the news and are actively reading it and engaging with it, but also being informed of, that lived experience. If their journalists aren't able to cover it and share that perspective of being an AAPI individual, an Asian American, then how is the perspective in that story then changed? I think one of the conversations in DEI is unintentional biases, and that can easily come in play if you don't have reporters who represent that community actively reporting on that community. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Diana. And that kind of leads into my next question, just kind of highlighting all the challenges that you've both discussed. How would you say the AAPI community gets their news or receives information on just day-to-day news? Again, the Philadelphia Inquirer, that's the go-to for many people in this region, but for the AAPI community, what are their outlets? Is it social media? Is it TV? How are they getting their news and engaging with it? Diana, I'll go back to you.
Sure. I think so. In addition to some of the mainstream papers, there's the China Metro News, and there are, I think, probably a couple of smaller papers that for hyperlocal stuff, but a little bit of global coverage. There's that, but folks are also pulling a lot, and I'm speaking a little bit anecdotally from what my family does, which is they circulate a lot of information through WhatsApp and Facebook. And so they pay a lot of attention to non-American based media. And that ranges, including my mother sends me articles from The Guardian. And so I think part of it really depends on word of mouth and who's a trusted media outlet. And I think from my observations, it's clear that it is a combination of global news as well as a couple of specific language newspapers. And that's in large part because of the lack of nuance and coverage on AAPI communities and issues in a lot of the mainstream publications in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. And Aishika, I'll pass the question to you, but I'll add on, as you do your work for the chamber, what are ways that you've seen, in communicating with members that works? Is it a newsletter? Is it social media? Like, what methods and tools are you using to get engaged with your community members?
Yeah, I wanted to build off what Diana was saying about trusted news sources. Um, as she mentioned, like my parents also get a lot of their news from WhatsApp and just forwarding articles between their community, their friends and family members. So it's been interesting hearing their perspective about issues, because I feel a lot of context is lost when they're sharing all this information within their communities and everything. So I think in terms of the chamber itself, what we've been doing is direct outreach to a lot of Asian-owned businesses, whether that's through newsletters as well as social media, and also using ethnic newspapers as well, and translating all of our resources and press releases into different languages for those newsletters has been most helpful. And really like making sure we built that trust with Asian-owned businesses, because I think there is sometimes just a fear of not having their stories represented by like mainstream media sometimes. So really making sure like we're here to help them has been very helpful. And I think one of the best things we did was just calling businesses directly or like sending direct emails, and we've received a lot of engagement through that. And then for one event, and specifically with like PCDC, which is the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, we actually used WeChat to promote our events, and translating like our event information into Chinese for that community. And with that, we like received a lot of participants for that specific event as well. So yeah, creating that language accessibility was very helpful. I feel like we always go back to it, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting too, because I think something that you and Diana both touch upon was just the use of like social media, WhatsApp, to kind of share global articles. And I wonder, because it's been such a big conversation, like here in American culture, but the issue of fake news and whether or not that's something that the communities are facing and how they're handling that. Because, within the last 4 years and the last presidency, fake news was something that was thrown all around, and social media was pointed as the source of it. So I wonder, are those question marks still coming up when sharing articles from Facebook or The Guardian or, any type of global news coverage, even though it is language accessible? Are there any concerns of it not being accurate or, accurate or effective or telling the real story? Diana?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I think one example of concern about fake news is coverage on China and kind of like the Hong Kong, covering, I think, like conflict between China and Hong Kong. And there's a really, really big difference between what the Chinese government-owned media is putting out versus what the rest of, I'll just say like Western media outlets are putting out. And I think that is something where you can see a really, really stark difference in terms of, not necessarily bias, but I think like a focus on different pieces of the same story. But I think that type of perspective, and then having, and I apologize if you can hear in the background, my dog Darla is just kind of like moaning, moaning for attention. I think like, and then another one that kind of, I think when January 6th happened, there were a lot of, there were Asians who were participating in that. And I think that there was confusion about how that information got circulated and why people were there. And again, kind of like anecdotally hearing from an Asian-led podcast that I listened to, one of the nuances, since the podcast hosts one was Japanese and one was Vietnamese, they were just talking about, again, the nuance that Southeast Asians, especially those who have been dealing with the fallout of the Vietnam War, have a really deep distrust of any sort of language around a socialist or communist agenda, and that triggers a lot of fear. And so, depending on the news that they consume, it really heightens something that, I'm not sure if people fully realize when sometimes fake news reaches other folks and it drives them to take action, how much is just grounded on, small points of fear that then results in isolated and siloed communities taking action.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
that's some of the discourse that I've been seeing, at least with those two examples.
Yeah. Aishika, I see you're nodding your head. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, anecdotally speaking as well, I think one of the major things I've seen is about vaccines specifically, and the side effects of the vaccines. Just because my parents, they consume a lot of Indian media, and with everything going around in India still to this day, there has been a lot of misinformation about the effectiveness of vaccines and what they cause and stuff. And it's been spread by politicians in India as well. So that's extra harmful in terms of the fake news aspect of it. And I know when we got our vaccines, my mom was really worried about side effects and everything. And it was really hard sometimes to share that information with her because there isn't a translation services around vaccine knowledge for different communities as well, and everything. So that was very hard to wade through. But I think in speaking with it, it's just community knowledge has been very helpful with vaccine awareness and just sharing, people sharing their stories and everything about what they experienced.
Yeah, I can imagine. The vaccine has been a hot topic for a lot of communities of color. And so that's a good point for my next question. And I think all of us being a PR organization are always trying to think about, how can we reach as many people as possible with the stories of our clients and our organizations. And, understanding that there is, language barrier or that there may need translation services. I'm wondering if you both could offer any advice to us as to how to make sure that our stories or are reaching, AAPI community and that they're engaging it with it right. Is it directly working with newsrooms? Is it offering translation services on some of our press releases? What are tools, I guess, that we should be thinking about in making sure that our stories and our pitches are accessible and ultimately reach your communities? Diana, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I'd love to take a shot at that first. So definitely all of the examples that you mentioned, and I'll dive deeper into a few of them. So in terms of some of the smaller papers, one thing that would be very helpful is sort of getting to know some of these communities by understanding what they're interested in, and then placing ads accordingly as a way of kind of just learning a little bit about community interests and needs. And then, so, that's kind of slowly over time, then you sort of see the return of that and understand a little bit more about the community that you're speaking to. Another thing for translation services that definitely continues to be something that is very, very helpful. So the Inquirer, when they were working on translating their 2020 election and voting information, they did get a grant that helped them so that they could consult with local organizations like Viet Lead and the Metro Chinese Weekly. And so efforts like that, if they can be replicated, grant funding is a tricky thing to always say, you can only rely on this. But I think that the idea of partnering with community organizations as a way of getting those translation services so that they're culturally relevant. I think oftentimes too, if you do something very formally, then that's not how people speak colloquially. So if you just use a translation service that isn't focused on urban areas or something like that, then the message could get lost a little bit that way. Another way is that a lot of these organizations could use volunteer support, especially for PR training. Many of them, these nonprofits, they're running on a shoestring budget. And so many of their positions are grant funded. And so there usually is not room for any sort of marketing, or even like unless they have like a social media intern or something. It's something that these organizations could really use, even if it's like a series of free workshops that are accessible. And I think like kind of another thing that is a little bit more of just like an indication of like, we see you, or we want to see you a little bit more, is having coverage outside of major holidays. And so a lot of times it has to be a really extreme thing, like a racist incident. And even then, like, you know, hundreds had happened before it even got coverage. But then the other extreme is when we talk about Lunar New Year, and like, there's so many stories in between. So even thinking about reaching out to an Asian-owned business just to talk about the state of business in Center City or something, and not treating the AAPI community like they can only talk about their identity, but that they have all these other experiences that they can contribute to the Philadelphia experience and economy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's one of the things for PR professionals that we think about a lot is what's the timeliness of this, and how can we make it timely, or what's the hook of it? And so you look at Chinese New Year, Lunar New Year, you look at AAPI month, and you're like, okay, you know, what stories can we fit into that box? But again, to your point, there are individuals in the AAPI community who are experts on things beyond that. So doing the work to engage those folks and engage them more than just, you know, whatever holiday it is, I think is important, and probably key to just starting to move that discussion forward, and highlighting the community more than just whatever holidays are related to it. Aishika, what about you? Do you have any advice on just how to engage the community beyond you know, the holidays, and making sure our stories are reaching them?
Yeah, I think with similar to like Diana's point, I was actually recently at a virtual event with the Asian American Journalists Association, where the journalists there, they were talking about how a lot of their stories weren't picked up except outside of Asian American Heritage Month oftentimes. So really making sure Asian journalists also have the opportunity to tell their stories outside of just like specific months and events, I think is important. Besides that, as the communications director for the chamber, I think what's been helpful is directly working with grassroots organizations that have already built that trust within smaller communities in the Philadelphia area, such as CMAC or Viet Lead, or like PCDC, as I mentioned before. And since they already have like hubs and headquarters and offices in that communities, we can like easily access those businesses more. And they already have that trust within those communities. So I think it's very helpful in terms of just reaching out to those organizations, not just as spokespersons, but as a way to like talk to the community members specifically through them.
Yeah, and I think you and Diana both touched on the point of collaboration, and just being willing to engage beyond you know, a specific ask, but just trying to learn about that organization or how they're engaging with the community. And I think those are two important parts. But I think for a lot of people, there's an aspect of intimidation that comes with it, especially if language is a barrier. So I'm wondering if there are any other ways of engagement. Aishika, I'd definitely be interested in hearing about how you work with the chamber and just engaging those communities, but other ways of engagement to engage the AAPI community. It sounds like, you know, direct contact is the best way to do it, but if you are intimidated by that, what other ways are there? Aishika, I'll start with you.
That's such a good question. Besides direct contact, I think like the main thing is like just social media has been what we've used a lot, as well as the newsletters. So in terms of newsletters, it has been like we've segmented our newsletters into like certain groups, such as specifically Asian business groups, and then within that, which communities we're specifically targeting in terms of Indian Americans or like Chinese American owned businesses, etc. And then really like trying to translate our services to like make sure the information is out there. And as well, the city has been very helpful because they already have a lot of translated resources for businesses. So it's been sharing that. And then if there hasn't been that translated services for these communities, just making sure like we can find a translator and translating them ourselves.
Diana, what about you?
I would like to, I think, talk a little bit about some in-person stuff that, there are some tactics that I think are pretty successful. And as things start opening up, I think it could be an interesting way to move forward. So as I've mentioned, I'm a contributing editor for Root Quarterly, which is a print magazine based in Philadelphia. And one thing that we do is that so our focus is on local publishing and highlighting largely mid-career artists and businesses. And so part of what we do in terms of really highlighting individual makers, as well as the communities that they end up serving or the community that builds around these folks, is to, we would have events. So we, aside from subscriptions, we sell through independent bookstores. And so as a way of, again, highlighting smaller independent businesses, we would have events either at these bookstores with the intention of going into different neighborhoods so that we're not really centralized in Center City. And that, and then accordingly, when we do that, we also, and again, because we highlight so many artists, there's oftentimes a music component or like a talk with an artist or something where we are able to bring in, I think, kind of like a more well-rounded experiential way of communicating and connecting with people, which I think also helps a little bit with, if there's a language barrier, there's also the cultural barrier, and a way to, again, I think like build trust and also meet people where they are is to, hiring local translators, but also hiring local talent. So if you are going to have something where there's an opportunity to have a performance, use it as a way to really highlight again, to say like, hey, if you look at the Filipino community, there is the food, there is there are the performances, there are the writers, and they're different and they contribute in different ways. And to sort of highlight that in little things like who you choose as a vendor, really then like that's the kind of thing that helps with the word of mouth reputation long term, that they reached out and again, like not everybody knows how to find a lot of these cultural performers, and that's where you can go to the chamber or to PCBC or to Asian Arts Initiative, but somewhere again where you ask some of these organizations as a part of collaboration and long-term trust building and partnership, ask for their recommendations, because they will know more of the folks on the ground. And that's where people really appreciate when you've gone with, someone who's beloved in the community, who's not used to always being in the spotlight. And especially again, outside of AAPI Heritage Month, which is unfortunately when a lot of these performance groups get coverage or, stage time.
Yeah. And if you haven't seen it to the audience, I'll share in the chat. But Diana recently published an article with the Inquirer highlighting a few AAPI-owned businesses. So I'll drop that in the chat. But again, it's kind of building that trust and reaching out and asking the question is what I'm hearing. Would you agree with that, Diana?
Absolutely. It's okay if you don't know. I mean, you can come with like the full transparency that this is not your community, but you want to learn more so that you can better speak to them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know that we're getting close to the end time. So if there are any questions from the audience, submit them in the Q&A. But, in the idea of just like making space and providing you both with an opportunity to kind of share your thoughts and your perspective. I kind of want to offer you final words of advice or call to action to our group as to how we can move forward and engage the AAPI community a little bit more, whether, it's highlighting some of the things that we discussed before, doing that direct outreach, engaging with the chambers. I'd like to kind of just offer you both an opportunity to give us your best advice, I guess, and how to kind of move forward and do next steps for engaging with the AAPI community. So Aishika, I'll let you go first.
Okay. I think as we mentioned before, Asian Americans just aren't a monolith. In terms of what Diana was saying about like cultural competency, I think that's something like to be very mindful of. And at the Chamber, we often like collaborate with other organizations specifically to learn about that cultural competency, so then we can create content that really like caters to why such and such issue is so important for different communities to care about. Like if we're talking about like PPP loans or something, it's important to like phrase it in a way that it makes sense to those communities and understandable for those communities. So I think that's very something to keep in mind, is just segmenting and like thinking about like how certain words and language might affect different communities within the Asian American umbrella specifically. In terms of like working with Asian American, supporting Asian American communities outside of just news and media, I think its donations to like specific organizations is very helpful, especially within the past year. And I know like Asian Mosaic Fund, which is a giving circle specifically that gives back to Asian American organizations in the greater Philadelphia that might not have the ability to like apply for grants or things like that. If you can, I'd like suggest learning more about these grassroots organizations and like thinking about which ones you want to donate and give money to. And I think that's very helpful.
Yeah. Diana?
My advice would be to don't drop off after you start engagement. It's really important, especially in this trust building process. There is a very negative portrayal of journalists parachuting in and getting people to talk about oftentimes something really painful that happened to them, oftentimes trauma related, even if someone just had their house burned down and you shove a microphone in their face to get them to share something in the moment and then never return to that community. It's like that causes more damage than when you start off. And so if you are making the effort and you're starting to make headways and starting to get some of those community referrals, it's just leave that door open. And that does mean more frequent engagement, sort of like connecting again, going past Heritage Month or past maybe either the original reason for your we can say like transaction or story or something, but let people know that you value working with them and partnering with them, and not that you're using them for your benefit and your narrative. And disaggregate data, always, always.
Yeah, no, and again, it goes back to that idea that the AAPI community has so many different layers to it, and taking the time and doing the work to learn about each of those layers, making sure not to do anything that tokenizes or highlights them in a very, I guess, just to the point of the model minority, right? Making sure to move away from those conversations that groups the individuals together, as opposed to highlighting them as different communities and different layers and different heritages and cultures. I think it's kind of key to just being comfortable enough to take that first step and do that engagement on your own. So I would encourage everyone to at least, well, Diana and Aishika have done a great job, highlighting and sharing their perspective, to do a little bit more work and dive a little bit deeper into the AAPI community, and learn a little bit more about the work that they're doing and how to meet them where they are. Well, I know that we're close to time, so I just wanted to thank you both for participating in today's event. Really appreciate you just kind of sharing your voice and giving us ideas and feedback on ways that we can be more impactful with our engagement. So thank you both.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
London, any final words before we wrap up?
No, like I said in the beginning, this is going to be recorded, so we'll have that sent around. And thank you both for joining us. You mentioned a lot of really good resources, so if you have any that you would like to share, we're happy to include that in sending it out to everybody that registered today. But otherwise, just thank you for sharing and helping educate our members so that we can be good partners to your organizations, to journalists, to the AAPI communities in Philadelphia and beyond. And thank you, Sam, for organizing this and moderating.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Looking forward to seeing you at our next event, hopefully June 16th, DEI in the workplace. Thanks.
Thank
Have a good day.
Thank you.